In February of 1959, 9 young hikers pitched a tent on a remote mountain pass in the Soviet Union. They were experienced, they were prepared, and by the following morning, every single one of them was dead. When search teams finally located the tent 3 weeks later, they found it slashed open, not from the outside, but from the inside. Something had made 9 people cut their way out of their only shelter and run into minus 30-degree temperatures, barefoot, half-dressed, into the dark. As the bodies were recovered one by one across the mountainside, the injuries began to defy every possible explanation. Crushed ribs with 0 external bruises, a skull fractured, with no impact marks. One woman was missing her eyes. Another was missing her tongue. Clothing tested positive for radiation. The Soviet investigation lasted 3 months, and then it was sealed. The official cause of death was listed as an unknown compelling force. 67 years later, that force still has no name. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a 5th-year radio engineering student at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. He was known as a meticulous planner, someone who didn't take unnecessary risks. Alongside him were 8 others, 7 men, 2 women, all university students, all experienced in winter hiking. For many of them, this trek through the northern Urals was nothing extraordinary. They had done harder routes before. They knew the terrain. They knew the cold. Their destination was Otterton Mountain. The trek was supposed to take 16 days. By February 12th, they were expected to send a telegram confirming their return. That telegram never came. Here's what we know from their diaries and photographs. On February 1st, the group reached the slopes of Kholatsyakhl, a name that translates from the local Mansi language as Dead Mountain. They set up camp around 5 p.m. They ate. They wrote in their journals. Some of the final entries mention playing a makeshift newspaper game to pass the time. Nothing about the photographs or writings from that evening suggests anything was wrong. The last photograph was taken sometime after sunset. It shows the group digging into the snow to create a level platform for the tent. They are smiling. By the next morning, everyone in that photograph was dead. The search began on February 20th, 19 days after the group's last known contact. A small search party, including fellow students and military personnel, flew over the pass. On February 26th, they spotted something from the air, the tent. It was collapsed, half buried under snow, and it had been cut open and long, deliberate slashes through the canvas from the inside out. The group's boots, their warm clothing, their coats, all still inside. Whatever pushed them out of that tent, it was urgent enough that 9 experienced hikers chose certain death by exposure over staying inside. The first bodies were found near the tree line, about 1,500 meters downhill from the tent. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonyshenko, both shoeless, both wearing only their underwear. A small fire had been lit beneath a cedar tree. Branches had been broken off up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed the tree to look back toward the tent. 3 more bodies were discovered between the cedar tree and the tent, Igor Dyatlov among them. Their position suggested they had been trying to crawl back up the hill toward their shelter. They died facing the tent. Dyatlov's hand was frozen around a small branch, as if he had been holding on to something in his final moments. It took another 2 months to find the remaining 4 hikers. They were buried deep under the snow in a ravine 75 meters from the cedar tree. And when the snow finally melted and their bodies were uncovered, this is where the case becomes unspeakable. The first 5 bodies showed signs consistent with hypothermia, death by freezing. It was brutal, but it made sense. They had fled into extreme cold without adequate clothing. The cause of death, for them, was not mysterious. The remaining 4 were another matter entirely. Lyudmila Dubinina, 20 years old. Her ribs were crushed, both sides. The force required to cause those injuries had been compared by the medical examiner to the impact of a car crash, but there was no external bruising, no damage to the skin or soft tissue. Her ribs had shattered from the inside while her body remained intact, and she was missing her eyes. Semyon Zolotaryov, 38 years old, the oldest member of the expedition. Both of his eye sockets were crushed. His skull was fractured. No external wounds. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, his skull was crushed with such force that the medical examiner noted it would have required pressure comparable to being struck by a high-speed vehicle. Again, no external trauma. And then there were the details that didn't fit any category. Some of their clothing, specifically Dubinina's sweater and the pants worn by one of the men, tested positive for radioactive contamination. Not lethal levels. Traces. But traces of what? And why? Several bodies had an unusual orange discoloration of the skin, most pronounced on the faces and hands. One theory suggested it was from the tanning chemicals used in the mortuary. Another suggested it was consistent with exposure to an unknown substance. Dubinina was missing her tongue. Not cut, not injured, missing entirely from the root, as if it had been removed. 9 healthy young people. Injuries consistent with explosive force. No signs of a struggle, no signs of an avalanche, no signs of an animal attack, and no explanation. 67 years of investigation have produced dozens of theories. Here are the 4 most serious, and why none of them fully explain what happened on Dead Mountain. The avalanche theory. In 2021, Swiss researchers published a study arguing that a small slab avalanche could have caused the panic inside the tent. Their model showed that a delayed slab, triggered by the group cutting into the snow to build their platform, could have slid hours after they set up camp. The problem, the slope where the tent was pitched, has an incline of approximately 15 degrees. Avalanches do not occur on 15-degree slopes. The tent was still standing. There was no debris field. The injuries sustained by the 4 hikers in the ravine are inconsistent with avalanche trauma, which typically produces blunt force injuries to the entire body, not targeted internal damage with no external bruising. The military test theory. Throughout the 1950s, the Soviet military conducted weapons tests in the Ural region. Witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky on the night of February 1st, bright orange orbs moving slowly above the mountain. Some researchers have speculated that the hikers were caught in the blast radius of a missile or parachute mine test. This theory explains the internal injuries, it explains the radiation, it explains why the Soviet government sealed the investigation, but it doesn't explain why the bodies showed no chemical residue, no blast debris, no shrapnel. A military explosive would leave traces, none were found. The infrasound theory. Certain wind conditions can generate low-frequency sound waves, infrasound, that are imperceptible to the human ear, but can induce panic, disorientation, and a desperate compulsion to flee. The unique shape of Kolochiyakul could, under the right conditions, create this effect. This would explain why they ran. It would not explain the internal injuries. It would not explain the radiation, and it would not explain why a woman was missing her eyes and her tongue. The paradox of the evidence. That is the real horror of this case. Each theory answers some of the questions and completely fails to answer others. The avalanche explains the panic but not the injuries. The military test explains the injuries but not the absence of chemical evidence. The infrasound explains the flight but nothing else. The evidence does not converge on a single answer. It points in many directions at once. And that is not how real events behave. Real events leave one trail, one sequence of cause and effect. The Dyatlov Pass incident does not. The The Soviet case file was sealed until the 1990s. When it was finally declassified, researchers discovered that key pages were missing. Witness statements, autopsy details. The photographs taken of the bodies at the scene, incomplete. In 2019, Russian authorities briefly reopened the investigation. They concluded, with no apparent irony, that the cause of death was an avalanche. The same avalanche that could not have occurred on a 15-degree slope. And then they closed the case again. Perhaps the most disturbing detail is not in any official file. It comes from the families. Several relatives of the victims reported being discouraged from asking questions, told to accept the official story, told in some cases that it was better not to know what happened to 9 people who walked into the mountains and never came home. 9 people entered the Ural Mountains. Nothing came back but questions. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains unsolved, not because investigators failed, but because the evidence itself refuses to make sense. It contradicts itself. It points toward answers, then pulls away. It is a case where knowing more has only made the picture stranger. 67 years, hundreds of theories, and still, no single explanation that accounts for tent, slashed from the inside, barefoot flight into lethal cold, crushed bodies with no external wounds, a missing tongue, missing eyes, radiation that shouldn't have been there. Some cases are solved by time, some are solved by science, and some remain on the mountain, buried under the same snow that covered 9 bodies in February of 1959, waiting for a truth that may never come.